Welcome back, folks. So we are now in our second mini lecture for week 3 of Psych 140. And here's where we're really going to be zooming into this idea of how we make impressions of other people. We're going to be talking about exactly how quickly we form our first impressions, exactly what sticks out to us in these earliest moments of getting to know other people, and a tiny taste of this question of whether first impressions have any accuracy. And I want you to still be contextualizing this in terms of this idea of conserving mental energy. Kind of cutesy term that we use for this as social psychologists is talking about people as cognitive misers. This idea that we are very stingy, we are very frugal with our cognitive energy. And so, if possible, we try to make things like first impressions very, very quickly and very efficiently, sometimes sacrificing accuracy. All right, we're going to get things kicked off with a quick activity. You are going to be seeing a series of faces, but they are going to be appearing incredibly briefly. I want you to also, so press pause on this video if you need to, open up the thin slicing worksheet spreadsheet that I have linked on our Moodle page. You are actually going to be entering numerical values indicating your impressions and your feelings about the faces that you see, and you're going to be doing that in that spreadsheet. So what I want you to do is for every face that I just briefly flash, I want you to first think about what you were able to detect about that person. Did you notice anything about them? Did you have a general sense of what they looked like? Pick up any characteristics like maybe their probable gender or their probable age, for instance. Then, specifically, I would like you to rate these folks on a 1 to 7 scale for how intelligent you perceive them to be. Again, I know you feel like you have nothing to go off of, but write down a number for intelligence, write down a number for attractiveness, and write down a number for trustworthiness. All right, please keep your eyes open, keep careful attention. These are going to go incredibly quickly. That was the first one. Take your time. So write down 1 to 7. Based off of what you saw, what would you give this person for intelligence, trustworthiness, and attractiveness? All right, ready for the next one? That was it. Trustworthiness, intelligence, attractiveness. All right, face number 3. So same deal. What could you tell about that face? Do you have any sense of who this person is? Any major features of who they are? And what rating would you give them based off of that information for trustworthiness, intelligence, and attractiveness? Face number 4. All right. Face number 5. All right. Face number 6. And face number 7. All right, so now that you've seen all of the faces, I'm going to show them to you with no time pressure whatsoever. These are the 7 folks whose images you just viewed. This woman in the top left is person number 1, person number 2, person number 3, person number 4, and so on. So the first thing I'd like you to do is look at your spreadsheet and remake those judgments of whether or not you perceive this person to be trustworthy, whether or not you get the sense that this person would be intelligent, and whether or not you think that this person is attractive. It'll take as long as you need to do that. If you want to pause the video. Now, the second thing I want you to pay attention to is those kind of additional comments you made. Anything you scribbled down as to what you were able to detect about the person, even seeing them for a 1/10 of a second. Because that's actually how long these faces were presented for. 100 milliseconds, which is literally a 1/10 of a second. And if you are anything like people in my prior classes or people in general, you were probably starting to make some judgments about things like this. You were probably able to make a pretty good guess as to whether someone was younger or older or middle-aged. you might have had some guesses as to how they might identify racially or in terms of their gender or what their biological sex might be. Now, just want to be very, precise in how I say this. You can never know how someone is going to identify, right, racially or in terms of their gender, based off of just the initial impressions you might make. And yet, there are still cues and signals that signal to many of us, right? This person is likely white. This person is likely East Asian. This person seems like they're presenting as a male. This person seems like they're presenting as a female. And those cues that tend to signal those things to us are things that we pick up on incredibly quickly. So even in even less time than that 10th of a second that these images were presented to you. Now, there's a second category of thing that we tend to notice very quickly. And it's these kinds of basic traits that might speak to somebody else's character, the kind of person they are. Do you perceive someone as likable, as friendly, as trustworthy? Do you perceive them as aggressive or dominant? Do they come off as competent or intelligent? Now, it takes our brains a tiny bit longer to arrive at these judgments. So this is actually 100 milliseconds versus 60 to 70 milliseconds, but that is still incredibly fast. Now, how do we know this? How do we know that people come up with reliable judgments of things like trustworthiness after only a 10th of a second? And this is data coming from studies where they would use different groups of people and present them with faces, just like you did, for varying degrees of time. So you have a group of people who sees a whole set of faces for a 10th of a second, versus for half a second, versus for a full second, versus for a minute. And they all make these judgments. You actually get incredibly high correlations between the judgments made by this 10th of a second group and the ratings that are made by groups that have no time pressure whatsoever. They already are starting to really agree about how people come off. So, for your spreadsheets, they should actually automatically be correlating your 10th of a second judgments versus your no time pressure judgments if you filled in numbers in both sets of columns. So the next question that comes up is, why are we making these kinds of initial judgments of other people? Why are some of the first things that we notice things like someone's age, their likely gender, their trustworthiness, or their dominance? And why are we noticing that maybe more so than noticing that they have a pink t-shirt on or that they have especially droopy earlobes, right? There's lots of other information we could be paying attention to, but we're not. And one thing that helps to explain this is something called the ecological theory of social perception. And this is the idea that even social perception is goal-driven, that our brains are adapted to perceive the characteristics about other people that matter to us and affect us socially. We are tuned to characteristics that facilitate social action. What does that mean specifically? Well, whether or not somebody else has droopy earlobes doesn't affect, most likely, whether or not they're going to be a friend or a foe. It probably doesn't affect whether or not they would be a competent ally in going and fighting a war together, right? But things like age do affect how you are likely to approach someone else, interact with them socially, what they would likely be like as a friend, as an ally, right? Someone's gender or sex might be relevant to you in terms of detecting the possibility for a romantic partner or a mate, right? Whether or not somebody looks strong and dominant and intimidating is going to be incredibly relevant in whether or not you approach that person in a really open way or whether you approach them in a very cautious way. These are the characteristics that matter when we're first deciding how to interact with another person. And so that's what our brains are optimized to detect first. Okay, so we're going to take a step back to the broad big picture. Of all the first impressions we form, many of them fall into two overarching umbrella categories. We're talking about things like people seeming intelligent, seeming friendly, responsible, trustworthy, serious, likable, aggressive. It turns out that this can really be boiled down to two underlying dimensions, the dimension of warmth and the dimension of competence. Warmth being things like the person having good intentions, trustworthy, friendly. Competence being things like strong, powerful, intelligent, responsible. And these, in many ways, are the first two things that our brains are trying to figure out when we meet a new person. Why is this? Why would it boil down to warmth and competence? Well, there's a lot of theorists who have argued that the warmth dimension is essentially a proxy for whether or not somebody else seems to have good intentions. And the competence dimension is a proxy for whether or not we estimate that they can carry out their intentions. So you could have somebody who seems like they mean the best in the world, right? They would be perceived as very high on warmth, but maybe not super powerful or intimidating. And so this person could be a great buddy, but they might not be the first person you turn to as an ally in an emergency situation. You could perceive people as being very high in competence, but not especially high in warmth. And in some ways, these might actually be the people you need to watch out for. Because if it happens that they don't have good intentions, they are very capable of carrying out any bad designs that they have. We are especially likely to feel positively towards people who seem to be high in warmth and competence, right? Like a doctor, for instance, a caring, attentive doctor, because those are the people who both mean the best for you and can also get the most done. And then finally, we tend to feel very negatively towards people that we would rate low in both. For instance, people tend to perceive the very poor or the homeless as lacking both warmth and competence. And we tend to have the least respect, the least consideration for people who fall in that category. All right, so to cap this off, I'm going to ask you to go and watch a very quick YouTube video where Northwestern researcher Adam Waits explains a little bit more about the connection between our perceptions of warmth and competence and how both of those contribute to trust. All right, I'll see you for our third video.